Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. As Andy said, we're going to talk about French Guiana and the Isles of Salvation. We're going to explain what that all means as we go along. Basically, what I'm going to do over the next couple of months anyway is I'm going to talk about the places we're going to visit. I'm also going to talk a little bit about ships in the sea, and I think I even have maybe one about the formation of the earth from a geologic point of view. Anyway, we're going to have a lot of fun. I do not have a final exam at the end of this series, so you don't have to take a lot of notes. There might be an oral exam if you want to meet me out in Baristas after one of my talks. You can examine me all you want. My wife Susie and I really enjoy meeting people, so anytime you see us in the terrace or the dining room or anywhere about the ship, you want to sit and chat, have a cup of coffee or have a meal, please feel free to join us. We're always happy to have people do that, and we really enjoy it. We call it a workcation. I work and she vacation, so it just works out really well. Anyway, anytime you do see us, please stop by. Now, I use dates, but I only use dates to kind of put things into a little bit of a sequence. I don't use a lot of dates. I try to just tell the story of the places that we're going to. So let's get started, and we're going to go off to French Guiana. Now, the Guianas themselves, there's actually three of them. There's three small countries, and they consist of former British and Dutch colonies, as well as an overseas department of France. Each of those Guiana countries officially uses the language that it was part of its colonizing. French Guiana is very sparsely populated. There are less than 6 inhabitants per square mile. And more than 3/4 of the people who live there are descendants of either African slaves or indentured workers. Archaeologists discovered about 273 Amerindian sites on land that was recovered along the Sinemary River, and that's the thing that's circled there in red. Now, some of those sites date back as far as 2,000 years. The history of French Guiana really doesn't span much more than just a couple of centuries, because there's very little written history of the territory before the Europeans arrived. Evidence has been found that represent 3 distinct tribes here. Before 1492, the Kalina Indians inhabited the coast, and they shared their territory pretty well with the Arawak. Now, the Arawak fought with the Kalinda during their expansion off to the west toward the Amazon River, and later the Carib would all but wipe out the Arawak. Now, early exploration of America by the Europeans began in 1498, specifically South America, and that was when Christopher Columbus came to Guiana during his 3rd voyage. In 1604, France attempted to settle in the Guiana area. Daniel de la Touche, who was the Lord de la Rivière, was an experienced, more or less experienced, lieutenant general in the French Navy. He led an expedition of some 500 colonists to what is today's northern Brazil. It was called Equinoctial France, and that was the name that was given to his settlement. They founded a village they called St. Louis in honor of the French king Louis IX. But, as with many things around here, that colony didn't last long. They were actually forced to abandon it by the Portuguese, who viewed their presence as a violation of the Treaty of Tordesillas. Now, that was a treaty that was written or developed by Pope Alexander VI. His papal bull basically split the New World between Spain and Portugal, and that red line says where the line went for the Treaty of Tordesillas. The Spanish were given the Americas to the west of the line, and the Portuguese were given everything to the east. So basically, the Portuguese got Africa, what we know of today as Brazil, and all the rest of it went to Spain. Now, that left France, the Netherlands, Germany, and England without any way of getting a sea route to anything except up in Northern Europe. Why? Because most of them were Protestant, and the Pope couldn't care less. In 1635, Cayenne was established by the French along with some small-scale plantations. It had to be abandoned following Amerindian attacks. The French once more came back, only to be attacked by the Dutch. Everybody wanted to get their foot into this place. Finally, I guess about 29 years or so later, the colony came under the direct control of the French crown, and French Guiana became a reality. Its first governor was Jean-Baptiste Colbert. His great-great-great-great-grandson does not have a television show. He undertook a policy of agricultural development. He encouraged plantation owners to grow sugar and cotton and cacao and spices. Paper mills, brickworks, and mines were built all across the country using African slave labor. In 1716, coffee plants were brought to French Guiana from the island of Martinique. The Treaty of Paris gave control of the present-day Canada to Britain. Now, what does that have to do with everything else? Well, that left the things to the south, including Martinique and some other things, to be given to the French. So the French decided, well, I guess we're going to have to go colonize Guiana. So they sent a large expedition here because there were stories of plentiful gold and easy fortunes to be made. 15,000 Frenchmen landed in the swamps at Kourou during the rainy season. It's called timing. The town, surrounded by marshes and rainforest, was pretty much unprepared for such a massive influx of people. And Kourou, just to let you know, that's the city on the mainland that's closest to the penal colony islands that we're going to go to. The settlers found a land filled with, among other things, hostile natives and tropical diseases. 12,000 of them, 80% of them, died the first year from malaria, dysentery, and yellow fever. To escape the mosquitoes, they fled to the offshore islands where constant sea winds drove the insects away. Those who survived returned to France. They told tales that left a very lasting impression. That impression earned the settlement the name the Green Hell. 1.5 years later, only a few hundred of the original 15,000 colonists were still alive. They named the nearby volcanic islands the Îles de Salut, or the Islands of Salvation. Isle Royal, St. Joseph, and Diable are about 7 miles off the coast of French Guiana. They eventually all kind of became referred to as Devil's Island, but only one of them, the little one up at the top there, is truly Devil's Island. The prison colony of French Guiana, as it was known, consisted of facilities on the mainland and on the 3 islands. Devil's Island is the smallest with an area of about 35 acres. It's a rocky, palm-covered island that rises only 130 feet above sea level, and it has very strong currents that swirl all around it. It became the most notorious part of the penal colony. Why? Well, I'm not really sure, because Devil's Island was the isolated home only for political prisoners. It was not used for any of the really hardened criminals. It was strictly used for people the government of France really didn't like. St. Joseph Island is the southernmost of the 3, and it was named after the patron saint of that very first expedition. It has an elevation of only 100 feet, and that makes it the lowest island in the group. And most of it is covered with very dense vegetation. During the penal era, the island was reserved for the most dangerous criminals, for the insane, and for solitary confinement. Ile Royale was the largest and westernmost of the 3 and had an elevation, oh, this was really a big mountain. It was about 200 feet. It's the highest in the group. It was the center of administration for the penal colony when the islands were part of the colony. Ile Royale is actually where our tenders are going to take us ashore. Now, this is a place you're going to see where most of the facilities still exist. Today, there's a hotel and a museum and some other things that you can visit while you're there. Also, when you're there, you can visit monkeys. Right after you get off the tender, as you're walking up this little roadway that goes up into the center of the island, kind of keep your eyes open and look up into the trees and stuff because the monkeys are there. But I will caution you to kind of hold on to your cameras or anything else because they might try to grab it. They like souvenirs, and they don't sell them. Now, shown on this map are the locations of really what I would call the major prison facilities. Now, in addition to the 3 islands, cells were located at several locations on the mainland. And they also had forced labor camps that were established all across the country. I didn't put all the forced labor camps because there are some further down into the interior. We're going to look at how all of this prison colony thing came about. Maximilien Robespierre was one of the best known and most influential figures in the French Revolution. He was instrumental in a period of the Revolution commonly known as the Reign of Terror. Robespierre largely dominated the Committee of Public Safety. That committee made Guiana a place of banishment for its political opponents. So in 1792, the penal colony was born. Shiploads, literally shiploads of deportees soon arrived. Nearly 600 were transferred to the Sinnamary River facility, and there they had no shelter and no food. 2/3 of them died. Not surprisingly, an opponent of Robespierre was also deported to French Guiana, and unfortunately, he died within a year. The political tide turned, and pretty soon Robespierre was considered an enemy of the state. I guess it's what goes around comes around. Anyway, Robespierre and his followers were declared outlaws. At the time, that meant that the fugitives could be executed within 24 hours of their arrest without being tried. Robespierre was captured in Paris in 1794, and he was held I guess, justifiably in the same cell where Marie Antoinette had spent her last hours. The next day, he was guillotined without trial in the Place de la Révolution in Paris, and hundreds of Robespierre's followers ended up being sent to French Guiana. 3 years later, only 54 of those people were still alive. In 1809, there was an Anglo-Portuguese naval squadron that invaded French Guiana, and they ousted the governor of the time. After 6 years, the Congress of Vienna decided, well, we'll give Guiana back to France. I guess that's because England didn't want it. Anyway, the Portuguese occupation, though, continued for about another 3 years, so maybe they didn't get the email on that one. When French abolished slavery over all of its domain, ex-slaves in Guiana fled into the rainforest, and there they set up villages that were very similar to those that they had been taken from in West Africa. They formed really a buffer zone between the Europeans who lived along the coast and the often still hostile native tribes that were a little further inland. They were called the Maroons, and the name came from an abbreviation of Cameroon, where they came from. Without the slave labor, the plantations quickly returned into the jungle. As many of you know, the jungle will take anything back if you don't keep hacking away at it and keep it cut back. The answer by the people, the government in French Guiana, was to bring shiploads of Indians and Malays and Chinese that were supposed to be coming in as laborers to work on the plantations. The whole idea was they were going to bring these people in, pay them minimum wages, maybe even have them as indentured servants, and just have them do the work that the slaves had formerly done. Now, that didn't quite work out because all of those people set up shops in Cayenne, and those shops became so lucrative that they never went out to work on the plantations. I mean, why go dig in the dirt when you can sell somebody clothing or whatever? Prince Louis was the third in the Napoleon line, or Napoleon's family, who would rule France as an emperor. And he declared the following, quote, 6,000 convicts in our prisons put an enormous strain on our budget. It seems possible to me to make the penalty of forced labor more effective, more moral, less expensive, and more humane by using it to advance the progress of French colonization, unquote. Great idea. Instead of keeping all the prisoners here in France, we're going to continue to put them on a boat and send them to South America. So began the mass deportation of prisoners to French Guiana. This is one of several watercolors that I'm going to use. This one's there by Francis or Francois Lagrange, and it's part of a collection of his paintings that depict life in the penal colony. And this one hangs in the University of Missouri's Museum of Art and Architecture, or Archaeology, excuse me. A decree was issued by the French government, and over the next 15 years, 18,000 French convicts were exiled to Guiana. The governor told them when they got there, the governor of the island said, quote, I have the mission of making you live a new life. In France, you are criminals. Here, I have seen nothing but repentant men." Unquote. The facility soon became pretty much overcrowded, so the prisoners were put to work building new prison facilities or put out on the coffee plantations. Saint Laurent labor colony in French Guiana, this is over on the mainland, became the reception center for all the convicts. Over the next half century, the arrival of large numbers of convicts necessitated the creation of some 17 auxiliary camps around Saint Laurent. In the prison colony, there were inmates who were everything from political prisoners to hardened thieves and even murderers. They were divided into categories according to the severity of their crimes and the imprisonment or forced residence that they were assigned to by the courts. The most dangerous of the convicts were sent to Ile Saint-Joseph. There were solitary confinement units and cells for the imprisonment of the insane. Penal labor camps inland for lesser crimes were established at several sites on the mainland, as well as over on Isle Royal. Political prisoners were all assigned to Devil's Island. In addition, those sentenced to less than 8 years of hard labor were to remain in the colony for a time equal to their prison time after their term ended. So in other words, if you got sentenced to 8 years in the penal colony, you ended up living in Guiana for a total of 16 years. Those sentenced to 8 years or more were required to remain in French Guiana for the remainder of their lives. The penal colony's hospital, it's shown here, was built on Isle Royal. At the end of the 19th century, as that period was approaching, a thing called the relegation law was enacted. Now this was kind of initial take, or another take on the original banishment thing, and basically the plan was to get rid of habitual criminals in France and to increase the number of colonists in Guiana. The law said that anyone who was convicted and had more than 3 sentences for theft, and those sentences were 3 months or more, would be sent to Guiana. So just think about that. You get arrested for shoplifting 3 times and you're going to go to Guiana. And not only that, once you got to Guyana, after you lived your term out there, which might only be 6 months or so, you were going to stay there. Now, French prisoners were transferred to a dock in France, most often in Marseille, and they were taken to the dock in shackles, and there they were put on board a naval prison ship to be transported to French Guiana. The major crime convicts were generally they were kept in the prisons for about 6 months and then settled the colony. A labor colony for women was opened for the support of the Sisters of, they had the support of the Sisters of St. Joseph of Cluny. Everybody says, oh, there must have been a lot of women. No, there really weren't. There were only about 517 women that were actually deported to the colony during the penal era. And the first female convicts arrived there in 1859. Now, the intent was that these women, when they finished their sentence, they would marry the male convicts after they finished their sentence, and they would colonize the area. Seemed like the right idea, but the women, I guess they were smarter than the French government thought they were, rejected the convicts, and they often made a little money on the side, I guess, by providing sexual services to the guards. Few of them ever married, and the government discontinued the practice in 1907. So, for 50 years they tried it, but it just didn't work. In 1889, another decree established the Special Maritime Tribunal. This sounds like a really nice thing, and that was to try the convicts for punishable acts that they performed while they were in the prison. And that included, among other things, recaptured escapees. It was headed by a naval officer who presided over the tribunal, and there was also an officer from the colonial troops and a special prosecutor. 3 penalties were possible as a result of the Maritime Tribunal. You could get ordinary imprisonment, added time, ordinary imprisonment for 6 months to 6 years. You could get solitary confinement for 5 months to 5 years. And when you kind of see these islands, you kind of understand solitary confinement was really brutal. It was a very small room where you had no physical contact with another human being. They slid your food into you and through a slot in the door, and your chamber pot went back out through a slot in the door, but you were never allowed outside. You never saw humans. Basically, the other penalty you could get was death, and that death was generally by guillotine. Prisoners sent to Guiana suffered pretty much appalling conditions. I mean, they worked building roads, they cut down trees, and they constructed facilities. They were given quotas of how much work they had to perform every day. And if they fell behind, if they didn't keep up with that work quota, they cut their rations. Well, they didn't have very good rations to go with. I mean, the rations were very, very meager to begin with. But if you didn't keep up, they cut your rations even further. And many were literally worked to death, and they were treated as slave labor on the mainland. A lot of them died with merciless tropical sun, just overheated, dehydration and so on, and a lot of them were attacked by malaria-carrying mosquitoes. The horrors of the penal colony settlement became notorious with the publicity surrounding a French army captain named Alfred Dreyfus. Dreyfus was an artillery officer of Jewish descent. In 1894, he was tried and convicted of treason, and that became one of the most intense political dramas in modern French history. Okay, so what's a little bit of background on that? A list of documents, actually they were secret French documents, was taken from the office of the German military attaché in Paris. Those secret papers had been previously given to the Germans by someone in the French army. There was a pretty hasty and inadequate investigation that was done, and that convinced an anti-Semitic intelligence chief that Alfred Dreyfus was the traitor. Now, apart from very vague resemblance between his handwriting and the documents that they seized, there was no convincing evidence and no witnesses that were ever provided. This engraving was printed in Le Petit Journal in 1894. Dreyfus was arrested and his court-martial held behind closed doors. The court found him guilty. Dreyfus, poor guy, he was unaware that he had even been convicted, but mostly that he was convicted on a secret dossier prepared by the Chief of Army Intelligence. Now, the conviction imposed the severest penalties. He was sentenced to life imprisonment, loss of rank, and degradation. Now, degradation basically then, and I guess technically it still does, means that he was paraded before the assembled troops, stripped of all of his army insignia and rank, and his sword was broken. Then he was bodily thrown from the fort by soldiers. As a political prisoner, Alfred Dreyfus was sent to Devil's Island, where he spent nearly 5 years. In 1895, there was a new intelligence chief, and that man was convinced of Dreyfus's innocence. He named a major named Esterhazy to be the real traitor. But the chief was unable to convince his superiors to re-examine the verdict of the original court. Alfred Dreyfus's supporters took the case to the public, charging Esterhazy with the crime. But the anti-Semitic press counterattacked, and the case turned into what is now known as the Dreyfus Affair. Novelist Émile Zola wrote an open letter to the President of the French Republic. In that, Zola, who was an influential writer and a major figure in the political liberalization of France, he wrote a letter that was entitled J'accuse, or I accuse. Zola charged that Alfred Dreyfus had been wrongfully convicted and sentenced. He declared the conviction was a miscarriage of justice. He pointed out that the military court had acquitted Esterhazy, although they knew him to be guilty. J'accuse was published on the front page of the Paris Daily. It accused the French army of obstruction of justice and anti-Semitism. Because of this, Zola hoped to bring the facts of Dreyfus's case before a civil court. He was pretty much partially successful because public outrage just grew and grew and grew, and there was violence in the streets that finally forced a new trial. In 1899, the government of France offered Alfred Dreyfus a pardon. He could agree to take it and would be let free. But accepting the offer would mean that he effectively admitted that he was guilty. And also, he could, if he said no, he wouldn't take it, he could face a retrial in which he would most likely be convicted again. Although Dreyfus was clearly not guilty, he chose to accept the pardon. He left his little hut. The little hut is in that circle. It's one of the very few huts on the island. There were never very many people on this island. And if you go around the island from boats, you can see the huts and so on over on Devil's Island. Now, whether we will have the opportunity for people to go over there, I don't know if we'll have the time, and even then it's kind of up to the local officials as to whether they'll let anybody get out there. But you'll see these little huts around, and these huts were really just basically little shacks that the political prisoners lived in, and they had a little garden with them and so on. Basically, that's where Dreyfus was. Anyway, he left that hut and he returned to France shortly thereafter. In 1906, Dreyfus was completely exonerated by the Supreme Court of France. This is the thing that I find most amazing. He returned to service in the French army. He was promoted and he was decorated. He served on active duty during World War I and retired after the war. I mean, talk about a guy who was loyal to his country in spite of what they did to him. I think that's absolutely amazing. He spent his retirement in relative obscurity. I mean, people just kind of forgot about him. And in 1935, he died, and his death went almost entirely unnoticed. He just showed up as a little note in the obituary section of the paper, and that was it. Zola himself, because of all of this, was convicted of criminal libel in 1898 and was sentenced to prison. His name was struck from the French Legion of Honor, which he had been a member of for most of his life. To avoid the prison, he fled to England, and he lived there for 2 years. During that time frame, the French government that was in place when he was convicted fell, and Zola was able to return to France, where he lived out his life. The Dreyfus affair deeply affected France. I mean, its ramifications continued for years. But it took 100 years after J'accuse for France's Roman Catholic daily newspaper to apologize for its anti-Semitic editorials during the Dreyfus affair. In 1923, Le Petit Journal published the first article by Albert Londres. It exposed the inhumane conditions at the penal colony in French Guiana. In 1938, the French government stopped sending prisoners to Devil's Island. I want to say Governor's Island because the Coast Guard had a base there off the end of New York. That's kind of what we called it. Anyway, the transport of prisoners to the island was discontinued by law. However, the prison was not physically closed until 1946, and the last repatriation of prisoners was not completed until 7 years later. Now, there's some questions that always come up about this time, and that's, did anyone ever escape from Devil's Island or any of the prison facilities? Well, yeah, there were a lot of attempts. There were many recorded attempts to escape from the penal colony. The only way out from the mainland camps, and there were a lot of them, in fact, most of the prisoners were on the mainland, was through very dense jungle and across very deep rivers. Untold numbers would try to escape by going up those rivers or crossing the rivers, and most of them fell victim to the crocodile attacks. From the islands, escape was only possible by boat. The waters surrounding them are shark infested. They're still shark infested. To keep prisoners from attempting to escape from the islands, the guards, this is a reportedly, it's not documented because, of course, they wouldn't write this kind of stuff down. The guards reportedly fed sharks leftover meat scraps as well as the bodies of convicts who had been executed. And there's even a rumor that they rang a bell and the sharks would hear the bell ring and they would come. Dinner time. The prison warden had inmates construct this swimming pool. It's on the beach near his home on Isle Royal. And that's so he and his family could bathe in ocean water safely. They didn't have to worry about the sharks. Unknown to the inmates on the other side, when we're talking about escapees, is that the prison would offer rewards. Actually had natives and people that weren't part of the prison thing on shore who were part of the prison community, and they intentionally would give escapees the wrong information, or they would lead them right back to the authorities. So there wasn't any really safe way to get off the island. There were no such things as friends over on the mainland. Most inmates died in attempting to escape the green hell, and many were captured and returned to prison to face a much harsher treatment. That included solitary confinement, extra work, and irons and shackles at night. And most of them, nearly all of them, had many more years added to their sentences. Now I'm going to talk about a few people who succeeded more or less in their attempts to escape. Clement Duval broke into a mansion in France in the late 19th century and stole 15,000 francs worth of property. Unfortunately, he accidentally set fire to the house during the burglary. He was caught about 2 weeks later trying to sell the stolen goods. And during his arrest, he stabbed a policeman who was trying to put him in shackles, stabbed that policeman several times. Then along comes his trial. In the trial, this guy had phenomenal numbers of supporters. And so these huge crowds of people came. And they circled this whole thing. And when Duval was dragged from the court crying, "Long live anarchy," I guess they kind of went crazy. He was condemned to death, but his sentence was later commuted to hard labor in French Guiana. While he was there, Duval contracted smallpox. He got that shortly after he arrived. He attempted to escape 20 times. He was finally successful in 2001. He fled to New York City, where he remained for the rest of his life. And Duval eventually wrote and published a book about his imprisonment, and that was entitled Revolt. And it was all about the conditions on the island. In 1920, a French army veteran, René Belbenoit, stole some pearls, and he was sentenced to 8 years in prison, sent to French Guiana, where he attempted to escape on a log canoe. He was recaptured and sent to solitary confinement. Belbenoit attempted to escape once more, but was recaptured and sent to solitary confinement. He was finally released in 1934 after spending 14 years in prison. In 1938, he wrote the book Dry Guillotine, and that was a memoir about his time in prison. His book was instrumental in exposing the real atrocities that were happening in the prison colony. Now about the paintings I've been showing you by Francois Lagrange. He was born in 1894 and very quickly displayed, I guess you'd call it a talent for painting, but even more, a gift of reproduction. He was really good at making false banknotes and rare stamps. Now, the false banknotes and the rare stamps gave him the opportunity to live a pretty good life of leisure and pleasure. But all good things had to come to an end, and his lifestyle basically attracted some suspicion. In 1931, he was sentenced to 10 years in prison in Guiana for forgery. A failed escape attempt led to a few months detention over on St. Joseph. And then back on Isle Royal, he created a mural in the island's chapel. Yes, they did have a chapel. He greatly improved his housing conditions because the guards saw the painting in the chapel and said, wow, maybe he could come and decorate my house because the guards had families. So come and decorate my quarters and paint murals and so on. So he would decorate the guards' rooms and all that. Lagrange was finally released in 1946. Well, this guy he didn't understand what release was all about, because within months, he was convicted of the crimes of forgery in the Netherlands and sent to Dutch Guiana. I guess he liked the tropical weather, I don't know. Anyway, he finally got released from prison there, and then he moved back to Cayenne before he moved off to the island of Martinique. Another criminal penal colony prisoner, the most famous prisoner, was Henri Charrière. Now, Charrière adopted the name Papillon due to a large tattoo of a butterfly that he had on his chest. And he was a thief who had been convicted of murdering a pimp. Now, there's no direct evidence that was ever offered against him other than a testimony of some, I'd call them dubious witnesses. He was sentenced to life in prison in 1933. The following year, Charrière escaped and made his way to Colombia. He actually got out of the prison facility, went to Colombia. In 1935, he was arrested there, and he was returned to Cayenne. He spent the next 2 years in solitary confinement on Ile Saint-Joseph. And he was put back on the mainland again, and he made his 9th and final escape in 1944. Papillon ultimately became a citizen of Venezuela. His autobiography wasn't published until 1970, and then in 1973, it was made into a movie starring Steve McQueen and Dustin Hoffman, and that's the one that's going to be running on the television. In his book, Henri claims that he used sacks filled with coconuts to float his escape from Devil's Island. Now, here's the catch. I don't want to be a warning kind of a thing. Anyway, the account is disputed by the French authorities. Records indicate that he was never held on Devil's Island. Remember, Devil's Island was only for political prisoners. And at any given time, there may not have been more than 16 or 20 people out on that island, and he was never one of them. But the records show that he escaped from a camp on the mainland. And the authorities claim that a lot of the incidents in the book are fabrications or experiences of other inmates. In 1946, the penal colony in French Guiana was abolished. 145 convicts were returned to Marseille, France. And ironically, that's pretty much where all of them had originally embarked on their long trip to French Guiana. Now, at first, this is where you kind of think about how unfair some of this stuff is. Only freed prisoners who could raise their own fare for return to France were able to go home. So you're a freed prisoner, you don't have a job, and you're in the middle of nowhere, and you have to pay your own fare? Anyway, some did make it home. French Guiana remained, basically because of that, home to a lot of freed convicts who had a pretty much an aimless existence. They just kind of wandered around. They didn't have anything that they could do. And today there are no survivors that are left there. So when you go there, you won't have a guide that'll take you around and say, well, this was my cell. It's kind of not like Alcatraz or Robben Island. Now, I have a few more minutes, so I'm going to just talk a little bit about when we were there. You tender into the island. It's really a kind of an interesting ride to go in by tender. You'll be able to see all 3 of the islands. The facilities that you'll be able to get to on Isle Royal are pretty much in ruin, but they're very interesting. The museum has some nice displays that kind of give you a feel for what life was like on the island. You can imagine what it would be like to live your life in these places. And the islands actually were probably better than some of the camps that were on the mainland, because out on the island they didn't have to contest with the mosquitoes and all the other critters that they had to deal with out over on the mainland. As you get there, you get off the tender, and there's a roadway that goes up. There's a couple of different paths you can take to get up into where the administration building and some of the cells and so on are, and you can take a road that goes down to the lighthouse and the hospital and so on.
It's a hard walk.
But it is a difficult walk. It's not the smoothest pavement. The last time we were there, they didn't have go-karts or anything to carry people around, so it's a walk. And it will be hot, it will be humid, so I would recommend you take a lot of water. I would like you to think about what it was like to live on that colony. The only critters that you're going to see out on the island, you may see some coatimundi, and you may see, well, you probably see monkeys, particularly as you're going up and down the main road into the center of the island. They're there. They're there as part of the welcoming committee. I think if they had the opportunity, they'd give them a little desk and call them tourist representatives. People can stay on the island. There is a hotel facility out there, and you can stay at that hotel. There is one caveat to going to the island or staying on the island. Over on the mainland in Kourou, there is the European space launch facility that's run by the French. And if they have a launch, people can't go out to the islands. You can't be on the islands. They shut everything down. Everybody has to come off the islands because the islands are directly under the launch path. And they just feel that that's a little bit too much of a risk. I guess if they still had it as a prison, they wouldn't feel that way. But anyway, because of that, there are times when people can't go there, but I don't think there's anything scheduled, because if it was scheduled, we'd already know about it, and the ship would already have made the announcement. I'm sorry, folks, but you'll be able to watch a rocket's red glare, but you won't be able to go to the island. So obviously, they're not going to have a launch tomorrow. Normally, what they do is they shut down the island a couple days before the launch, and then they'll close it until the day after the launch.
You said 2001, you meant 1901 on Duval.
Oh, yeah, 1901 on Duval. He wasn't that fresh. Anyway, it is a very interesting thing. I think you'll have a very nice day there. It'll be warm. It'll be humid. You won't have to worry too much about bugs. The tender pier is an interesting pier because it's a little different than some of the places we'll go to later on when we get to West Africa. We only have, I think, one tender port well, we got some in South America too, I think. But anyway, I want you to all have a good day. I'm going to go out to baristas, grab a cup of coffee, and then I'm going to come back in and listen to Norman's talk about something from outer space. It's out of this world, I know that. Anyway, have a very great day, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you very much for coming.